On first glance, what was your main takeaway?
Well, on first glance, I think the growth momentum looks to have been by and large maintained. If you look at the industrial side of things, still look like the recovery there is pretty strong. We're already exceeding sort of pre-COVID level. I think the key watch today was the retail sales number to gauge underlying consumer sector recovery. I still think that the underlying recovery is still ongoing. I think if you look at labor market data, clearly they've shown that 50 million migrant workers have been coming back to the urban areas almost fully by the beginning of the third quarter. If you look at consumer services, these are where most of the jobs for migrant workers have been. So that is, I think, in theory, supporting a more sustainable recovery because labor market growth, not really stimulus in China, but wage growth in China really is the driver of consumption growth. So I think we're still seeing incrementally positive news on the labor market supporting the consumption recovery. So for that, I think the retail sales data is one piece of evidence. It's not everything because we don't have a lot of the consumer services activity captured in retail sales. We only have online e-commerce and retail sales. But broadly, if you look at Golden Week data, if you look at tourism data, if you look at restaurant sales, they all seem to be supporting this recovery in the consumer sector, which I think by mid next year should be a much bigger driver of the post-pandemic growth recovery in China.
Julia, we've got a news conference just happening there in Beijing while you're talking. We just bring the images and any headlines which do emanate from it. But Julia, when you look at these numbers, what sort of implication or what do you deduce about growth looking ahead?
So I think it's still this structural driver that we're expecting to see. So on the one hand, I think, for now, China's growth recovery is being very much industrial sector led, it's being very export led. We don't see many signs of that momentum really weakening anytime soon. But I think that as we look out into the next 12 months, the pace of recovery will have to be more driven by the consumer sector, because that's where, remember, pre-COVID, China's growth was increasingly led by consumption. So we are still expecting that structural shift to reverse next year to be more consumption-led in terms of overall growth contribution. So I think in terms of the implication going forward, the labor market healing, it's still what we're looking for. We think is the most important thing to watch out for. There's still some structural pressures in terms of jobs, especially for younger college-educated college graduates. So there are still some cyclical pressures, but I think in terms of the recovery, it's we still think that in the next 6 to 12 months, we should see more labor market recovery leading and supporting this consumption recovery.
And what kind of GDP forecast do you have for 2021, Julia?
So we think that we should be looking at somewhere between 8 and 9%. I think that's taking into account the fact that the consumption-led recovery will be taking over. It's not as strong as the industrial and export side of things, so the recovery there will be more gradual. It's taking into account the fact that we're likely not going to see a whole lot of policy stimulus in China next year. If anything, we might see some policy shift at the margin towards tightening for certain sectors. It's taking into account the fact that I think the global recovery we still think is ongoing. We're expecting a pretty decent global rebound next year. That should help in terms of the overall growth backdrop. So we're expecting a rebound of between 8 or 9% next year.
And as you mentioned there, in terms of whether or not we see further stimulus, the PBOC already earlier this month kind of indicated it could be exiting from some of that heavier stimulus. When we look at the strength, though, of the currency, we've been talking about these June 2018 highs in the offshore yuan, and a chart too for our viewers showing this strength that we have been seeing. How much further do you think authorities here are willing to see this appreciation?
So I think we're still going to be looking at, I think, the broad dollar trend to gauge where the RMB is next year. I think our base case is that the dollar will still be on a mild downward trend in 2021, reflecting this more fundamental view that we're looking at a cyclical rebound in the global economy. So typically in that environment, you see the dollar performing a little bit on the weaker side. And also we have at the margin a reduction of geopolitical tensions next year. So that should also put a little bit more pressure on the dollar. So if that continues next year, then I think the RMB will be compensating for that. So it will be strengthening versus the dollar. So I still think that is going to be the biggest driver of where the RMB will be next year. If we stay on a mild downward trend for the dollar, we could very easily see another 3 to 5% appreciation in 2021 for the RMB.